There are corners of the world where silence feels older than the earth itself, where every sound seems borrowed and every echo carries a warning. The Smokewater Mountains, in the far reaches of eastern Tennessee, are one of those places. They rise like broken teeth above a sea of mist, their ridges folded over one another in green and gray. Travelers who wander too deep among them often speak of a hollow no map dares to name a hidden valley, where smoke sometimes rises without fire, and where prayers lose their way before reaching the sky. The locals call it Crowder's Hollow. Tonight, you'll hear what truly happened there. A history so long buried it blurred into superstition, a tale whispered by miners and preachers alike. Before we begin, if you believe that forgotten stories deserve to be told, subscribe now and stay with me until the end. When the last word fades, tell me what you think really took root in that hollow, because once you've heard it, you won't forget it. In the autumn of 1891, the sheriff of Whitlow County, Amos Kettering, received a letter that would change the course of his final years in office. It came from a sawmill foreman along the Smokewater Fork, written in a hurried scrawl. One of my men's gone missing near the ridge, left his tools, his mule, even his hat. There was nothing unusual about a disappearance in that country. Men vanished with alarming regularity, taken by rock slides, rivers, or whiskey. But this letter carried a detail that caught Kettering's eye. The foreman wrote that before the man disappeared, he had mentioned seeing smoke curling from a hollow that wasn't marked on any survey. Crowder's Hollow was known by name alone, and even that was seldom spoken. Some said it was a place where the sun set too early, where the air never truly warmed. Others claimed the land itself rejected company, that fences fell, crops refused to grow, and animals born there came out twisted. Still, Kettering was a man who believed in facts, not phantoms. He folded the letter and set it aside. But later that night, when the lamp burned low and the courthouse clock ticked into the small hours, he found himself reading it again. He didn't yet know why that name unsettled him, only that it felt like the echo of something he'd already forgotten. Whitlow County, at the edge of the Smokewater Range, was a place where law traveled slowly and superstition faster than news. The sheriff's badge carried little weight beyond the sound of his voice and the steadiness of his hand. Kettering was no stranger to wild country. He'd buried men lost to snow and madness, settled feuds over stolen mules, and once pulled a miner from a pit the man himself had dug. He understood that in the mountains, truth often wore the mask of folklore. But folklore, like a shadow, always followed something real. When he asked the townspeople about the hollow, they spoke carefully, eyes lowered. One old trapper, face creased like dry bark, said, "There's something down there that don't remember being human." Another muttered that the hollow was the mountain's belly, a place that swallowed what didn't belong. None of them could tell him who lived there now, or if anyone did. Yet, when he pressed further, a name surfaced: Murnell. The Murnells, they said, had claimed the hollow generations ago and never left it. "Best let them be," someone warned. "They keep their own Sabbath down there." For weeks the sheriff thought little more of it. Paperwork and petty crimes filled his days. But the name lingered like a taste of metal. Then another letter arrived. A circuit preacher traveling the ridge trail had vanished. His horse was found grazing beside a stream, saddle intact, Bible unopened. The preacher's hat lay in the mud, the initials S.D.B. stitched inside. The sheriff felt the quiet tighten around him, the kind that came before a storm. He set out the next morning, following the ridge where the preacher's trail had ended. The path wound between walls of black pine. Mist rose from the hollows like breath from sleeping giants. He saw no sign of the missing man, but as the sun dipped, he caught sight of something far below. A thin column of gray smoke rising from a basin the map did not name. The smell reached him faintly: wood smoke and something else, sweet and foul, like burning moss. The horse beneath him shifted uneasily. He watched the smoke until it faded, then turned back. There was no reason to descend that day, no warrant, no crime proven. But as he rode home through the gathering dusk, he felt a presence in the trees, a stillness so complete that even the insects had stopped their music. By the time he reached town, the air of Whitlow felt thin and fragile, as though he'd carried a piece of that silence back with him. Over the next weeks, stories trickled in from the camps, men hearing songs at night, seeing figures along the ridge, finding carved symbols on tree trunks that no one could read. Kettering listened, took notes, and said nothing. He was a patient man, but patience can become a form of fear. He told himself that if another man went missing, he'd go into that hollow himself. The mountain waited. It always did. Before Crowder's Hollow became a name to whisper, it was simply land unclaimed, unseen, unblessed. The first man said to settle there was Ezra Murnell. No one knew where he came from. Some claimed he had been a preacher turned heretic. Others said he was a soldier who deserted and found peace only in silence. What all the stories agreed upon was that Ezra walked into the Smokewater wilderness sometime around 1820, leading a mule and a woman who never spoke. He carried with him a single trunk filled with tools, seed grain, and a dozen Bibles worn thin at the edges. He built a cabin where the creek bent into shadow, and there he began to speak again, but only to God. Ezra's sermons were not meant for human ears. He would stand outside the cabin at dawn, facing the mist, reading aloud verses that he rewrote each season, bending them to fit a vision that belonged only to him. He preached that the world beyond the mountains had already fallen, that the Almighty had turned his face from mankind and sought new soil. He declared Crowder's Hollow a sanctuary where the blood of the chosen shall begin again. The woman who shared his cabin bore him 2 daughters, Alethea and Cora, and died soon after. Ezra buried her beneath a stone marked with no name, and from that day forward, the hollow belonged to him and to his faith. He raised his daughters as disciples rather than children. They were taught to read the scriptures but forbidden to read anything else. He taught them that every soul outside their hollow carried the taint of corruption, that men's blood was spoiled by greed, women's wombs by sin. When storms rolled through the mountains, he called them voices of cleansing. When lightning struck a tree, he said it was God's hand sharpening the world. Alethea, the elder, listened with fervor. She memorized every word, every strange commandment her father carved into the beams of the house. Cora, smaller and quieter, often wept during prayers, but Ezra said tears were proof of weakness. The world will drown again, he told them. Only those who build their ark in secret shall rise when the waters come. Years passed, and no outsider came close enough to see the hollow. Ezra stopped going to the nearest trading post, and soon his name became a ghost story told by hunters. Some claimed he was already dead. Others said he had turned his daughters into spirits that wandered the woods. In truth, he lived far longer than anyone guessed, kept alive by his obsession and by the obedience of the 2 young women who feared and worshipped him in equal measure. When he finally died sometime during a long winter, when even the creeks froze solid, Alethea and Cora buried him beneath the cabin floor, beside the woman who had given them birth. They sealed the grave with stones, painted each one with the spiral symbol he had carved into their minds. 7 lines crossing in the center, the mark of renewal. After his death, the sisters did not leave. Isolation had become their inheritance. Alethea took her father's place as the keeper of revelation, while Cora became her shadow. Without Ezra's voice, the hollow grew quieter but no less devout. Alethea claimed to receive visions during her fasts, dreams in which the old world was burning and she was called to raise a new one from the ashes. She spoke of a tribe yet unborn, a people cleansed of the metal sickness that filled the valleys below. In her dreams, the earth itself gave her instructions: what to plant, when to hunt, how to listen for the voices of the chosen. Cora believed because she knew nothing else to believe. Once a year, they would travel a day's walk to the edge of the nearest settlement, trading furs and roots for salt and iron. The people there knew to keep their distance. They were strange women, tall, pale, moving as if they carried their own gravity. They spoke little, their accents clipped and old-fashioned. Children stared but did not dare approach them. Men said that the sisters smelled of cedar and smoke, and that their eyes were not the color of any sky they had ever seen. When the sisters left, they always walked back into the trees without looking over their shoulders. The decades turned, and with them, the world beyond the mountains changed. Railroads stretched across the country, towns grew, and men began cutting deeper into the forests for timber and coal. Yet Crowder's Hollow remained untouched, forgotten by maps and spared by progress. Some said it was because the land was cursed. Others whispered that any man who tried to claim it disappeared, but Alethea saw it differently. To her, the untouched hollow was proof that her father's prophecy was unfolding, that the Almighty had walled them off from the world to preserve the seed of purity. Cora sometimes asked if they might visit the towns, just to see the people there, but Alethea refused. "The blood outside runs thin," she said. "If you step among them, the sickness will follow you home." By the 1870 seconds, the sisters were women of middle age, hardened by solitude. Their faith had evolved from doctrine into ritual. They kept a circle of stones where Ezra had once prayed, and lit fires within it during the solstices. They sang hymns backward to confuse evil spirits. They fasted for weeks, then feasted on whatever the forest provided. Their father's spiral symbol appeared everywhere, carved into doorframes, burned into tree trunks, drawn on their skin with ash. They believed that the world was counting down to a reckoning, and that only those born of their blood would survive it. And somewhere along the way, the hollow began to answer them. Travelers passing near its edges reported hearing voices in the fog. Hunters found offerings of bone and fruit laid at the roots of trees. No one dared disturb them. The Murnells were no longer merely reclusive. They had become legend, a story used to frighten children and to warn strangers not to linger after dark. The legend, as it turned out, was not exaggerated. By the time Sheriff Amos Kettering read his first letter about the missing men, the Murnell sisters had already spent years fulfilling their father's prophecy. Their solitude had become a religion, and their faith was waiting for new blood. The first disappearance might have passed unnoticed if not for the mule. It was the winter of 1873 when Simon Hale, a traveling peddler from Virginia, vanished along the Smokewater Trail. He was a familiar figure to the mountain families, selling knives, kettles, and stories from the lowlands. He'd ridden through Whitlow County twice a year for a decade, and never failed to return. But that February, his mule wandered back to the settlement alone, reins dragging, its saddle still burdened with unsold wares. A search party found Hale's wagon overturned near a frozen creek. His footprints led away from it and simply stopped at the tree line. The snow around them lay smooth, untouched, as if the forest had swallowed his trail whole. The sheriff at the time was not Amos Kettering, but a man named Bram Tully, old and half-blind. He shrugged it off, saying the peddler had likely met a bear or a cliff. Out here, the earth took what it wanted, and no one questioned its appetite. But a month later, a hunter discovered Hale's pack torn open beside a hollow log. Inside were his spectacles and a page torn from a Bible, the words smeared beyond reading. People began to talk then, quietly at first, and always with glances toward the Smokewater Ridge. In 1875, another man disappeared, a logger named Price Givens. His campmates said he'd gone down the mountain to fetch water before dawn and never returned. They searched until nightfall, but the only trace they found was a small cross of sticks, freshly made, standing upright in the mud. Someone claimed it looked like the mark of the Murnell sisters, though no one dared say their names loudly. Each year seemed to add another ghost to the hollow. A whiskey runner in 1876, a circuit preacher in 1878, a trapper in 1880. The pattern grew, too slow to cause panic, too steady to ignore. Men began taking longer routes to avoid the ridge entirely. Hunters swore they heard voices in the fog calling their names, soft and pleading, until they fled with hearts pounding and rifles shaking. Women warned their sons not to answer when the forest spoke. The old folks said it was the land remembering its debt. The younger ones whispered of witches. In the camps they told stories of two women who lured travelers with lighted windows and the smell of bread. Those who entered their house never walked out again. They sing you tired, the loggers said, then feed you a prayer you don't wake from. Even those who laughed at such tales began sleeping with fires burning through the night. When Amos Kettering took the sheriff's office in 1882, the stories were already part of the mountain's language. He dismissed them as folklore until he started keeping records of missing men. There were 7 names, spread across nearly 20 years, all last seen within a day's ride of Crowder's Hollow. Each case shared the same strange silence. No bodies, no tracks, no signs of violence, just absence. Kettering began marking the locations on a map. The pins formed a circle, and at its heart lay the hollow that no one entered. He rode there once, early in his tenure, determined to lay the matter to rest. The trail was faint, overgrown with laurel, but it existed. For hours he followed it until the air grew heavy, and the woods fell utterly still. Not the calm of peace, but the stillness before something unseen takes notice. He never found a house, nor a clearing, nor any proof that life remained within. Yet as he turned to leave, he caught the scent of smoke, thin, acrid, and close. When he looked back, the forest behind him seemed different, as if the trees had shifted while he wasn't watching. That was the first and last time he tried to reach the hollow alone. The people of Whitlow learned to live with the fear the way they lived with storms. They built their houses closer to the river and left the high ridges to whatever ruled them. Still, stories continued to drift down like ash. A farmer claimed his boy had found bones scattered near the creek, small and clean. A group of hunters swore they'd seen figures moving through the fog, tall and pale, carrying baskets woven from vines. A preacher from the valley rode up to investigate and came back pale as paper, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. "The Lord doesn't walk that ground," was all he would say. By the late 1882, Crowder's Hollow had become a kind of curse word, a name used only in whispers, as if saying it too loudly might summon attention. Yet, the mountain itself seemed to be waiting for something. There were nights when the wind shifted strangely, carrying the smell of burning pine even when no fire burned. There were mornings when the mist didn't lift until noon, thick and low like breath trapped over the land. Some said those were the days the Murnell sisters prayed. And then, in the summer of 1889, a new kind of man arrived in Whitlow County. He came not for faith or fortune but for science. His instruments gleamed, his boots were clean, and his eyes held the curiosity of someone who still believed the world could be measured and mapped. His name was Elias Monroe, a cartographer for the railroad company. He was told not to go near the hollow. He laughed and said, "If the map leaves it blank, then that's exactly where I need to go." He would be the first outsider in half a century to step into Crowder's Hollow, and the only one to come back. Elias Monroe arrived in Whitlow County on a mild morning in June of 1889, the air damp with the scent of pine and river water. He was 28, tall and well-kept, his speech clipped with the precision of a man used to being listened to. The railroad company had sent him to chart a potential route through the Smokewater Mountains, a project that promised to link the isolated counties of eastern Tennessee to the modern world. His instruments were packed neatly in iron cases, his maps rolled and labeled, his mind fixed on the simple logic of measurement. He believed that every piece of land could be understood if one only drew its lines correctly. In the town of Whitlow, he was met with a polite but distant hospitality. The locals were cautious around strangers, especially those who carried compasses and clipboards instead of rifles. They answered his questions with nods or half-truths, and when he mentioned the unmarked valley north of the ridge, they grew suddenly silent. The general storekeeper, an old man with one eye clouded white, muttered that the place don't like to be measured. A younger man added quietly, "Crowder's Hollow eats up the ones who try." Elias smiled, thinking it a superstition born of boredom. He thanked them, bought extra rations, and wrote in his field notebook that evening, "Local fear of Hollow persistent. Possibly due to terrain hazards or moonshine operations. Will investigate." 2 days later, he set out with 3 mules, 2 guides, and a crew of laborers to begin his survey. The men worked well under his command, clearing brush, setting up sighting poles, and marking elevations along the Smokewater Fork. By the 3rd week, they had mapped most of the region's accessible ridges. Only the hollow remained blank, a dark basin where the contours of the earth disappeared into shadow. The guides refused to enter it. "Trail ain't right down there," one said. "Steps feel borrowed." Monroe dismissed the warning and decided to go alone. "I'll be back before dusk," he told them. "If I'm not, it's because the path was worth more ink than expected." The path into Crowder's Hollow began as a hunter's trace, overgrown and narrow. The deeper he went, the dimmer the light became. The air smelled of moss and iron, and the sound of his own breathing seemed too loud. He noted the silence in his journal. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of deep woods, but something heavier, as if sound itself had been thinned out. The trees grew stranger two-bent, thick-barked, their branches knitted overhead to form a kind of vault. It felt, he later said, like walking beneath the ribs of a dead god. By afternoon the trail vanished altogether, replaced by a slope of slick stones leading downward. He followed it until the light broke through again, opening into a clearing ringed by mountains. There, tucked against the tree line, stood a single cabin, with smoke rising from its roof. He felt a cautious relief. The air smelled of burning cedar and cooking meat. He called out, announcing himself, but no one answered. Then the door opened. 2 women stepped outside. They were not what he expected. Their clothes were plain but clean, hand-sewn from coarse fabric, the kind worn half a century earlier. The older one had long, gray-streaked hair pulled tightly back, her face sharp and pale beneath the soot of the hearth. The younger's hair was darker, her expression uneasy, eyes flickering toward the trees as if checking for witnesses. Elias introduced himself with the manners of an educated man, explaining that he was surveying the ridge and had lost the trail. The older woman studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You'll rest here," she said. "The hollow keeps its guests." He thought she meant it kindly. Inside, the cabin was neat but primitive packed earth floor, shelves of dried herbs, jars of preserved roots. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sage. A fire burned low in the hearth. The women moved with quiet purpose, setting bread and stew on the table without a word. Only after a long silence did the older woman speak again. "You may call me Alethea," she said. "This is my sister, Cora. You've come far from the world." He smiled politely, taking notes in his head about their dialect, archaic, lilting, with a faint trace of the coastal south. When he asked how long they had lived here, Alethea only said, "Since before the sickness." He assumed she meant the war or some epidemic, and did not press. The stew was rich and unfamiliar, flavored with something bitter but not unpleasant. He asked what meat it was. "The hollow provides," Alethea replied. As he ate, he noticed carvings on the beams above him, spiral symbols cut deep into the wood, intersecting lines forming a pattern he couldn't identify. Beneath them hung charms of bone and twine. He made a mental note to sketch them later. Cora caught his gaze and shook her head slightly, as though warning him not to. Her hands, resting in her lap, were scarred and rough, the nails lined with dirt. After the meal, fatigue washed over him suddenly, heavier than any day's work should bring. His limbs felt weighted, his heartbeat slowed. The sisters spoke softly to each other, their words indistinct. The room began to tilt. He realized then that the taste of the stew lingered too long on his tongue. His mouth felt numb. He tried to stand, but the floor rose to meet him. When he opened his eyes again, there was no light. The air was damp and close, smelling of soil and iron. His hands were tied. Overhead, footsteps creaked on wood, and faint voices drifted down like whispers through water. He called out, but only his echo answered. Somewhere in the dark, something small moved, a scrape, a breath, a child's laugh. He thought he heard singing then, high and slow, words strung together without sense, but in rhythm, like a lullaby. He shouted until his throat hurt. The singing did not stop. It simply grew quieter, more intimate, until he could no longer tell if it came from above or inside his own head. Elias Munro, the man who believed the world could be mapped, had found the place that refused to exist on paper, and in that first night of darkness, he began to understand that Crowder's Hollow had never been lost, it had been waiting. Elias Munro could never be certain how long he lay in that darkness before time began to mean anything again. The first day, or what he assumed was a day passed in confusion. He drifted between waking and delirium, counting his breaths to stay sane. The air smelled of earth and mildew, heavy with the scent of decay. The floor beneath him was packed dirt, cold and damp. Whenever he called out, the sound fell flat, swallowed instantly. Eventually, he heard movement above. Slow footsteps, the creak of the trapdoor. A faint shaft of light appeared, weak and gray. Alethea's voice came first, calm and composed. "You are awake," she said, as though speaking to a guest rather than a prisoner. "You will need your strength." Cora followed, carrying a bowl and a tin cup. She set them on the floor and untied the ropes from his wrists, but not his ankles. The stew smelled the same as before, wild meat, bitter herbs. Elias refused it, shaking his head. Alethea only smiled, not unkindly. "You must eat," she said. "The mountain chose you. The hollow feeds its chosen." When he still refused, she turned to her sister. "Leave him for now. The body learns its needs." They closed the trapdoor, and darkness reclaimed him. Hours, perhaps days, passed in an unbroken rhythm of footsteps above, murmured prayers, and silence. Twice daily they returned, each time with food and water, each time repeating their scripture-like verses. Elias tried to memorize them. He heard fragments: "The seed renews, the blood cleanses, the old world burns." The words meant nothing, yet they carried the cadence of conviction. On the third day, the monotony cracked. From somewhere beyond his prison he heard laughter, not the laughter of adults, but light, high-pitched, echoing in groups. He pressed his ear to the damp wall. The sound came and went like wind children, many of them, whispering in a language he didn't recognize. he called out, and the laughter stopped instantly. When he whispered again, there came a soft thud against the other side of the wall, like small hands patting the dirt. Then, silence. He tried to remember the route he had taken, the turns and slopes. He could not. The hollow had disoriented him completely. His compass was gone, his pack, his instruments all taken. His mind turned inward, calculating possibilities. Perhaps moonshiners, perhaps religious hermits. Yet, even in fear, the rational part of him still measured the details. The food, though drugged, was cooked cleanly. The rope was old but expertly knotted. The voices above moved with routine precision. These were not savages. They were believers. That realization frightened him more than ignorance ever could. On the fourth day, Alethea came alone. She sat at the top of the ladder, her face half in shadow. "You wonder what we are," she said. "The world outside has forgotten its beginning. We have remembered." She told him that her father, Ezra Murnell, had received a vision of the world's end, that the cities would devour themselves, and only those born pure, away from corruption, would inherit the mountains. "You will help us," she said. "You will give us strength to continue." He demanded to be released, threatened her with the law, with the sheriff, with the company he worked for. Alethea tilted her head as though studying a curious animal. "There is no law here," she said softly. "Only covenant, and you are bound by it now." After she left, Elias tore at the ropes until his wrists bled. He tried to shout until his voice broke, but no one came. Only the faint hum of singing children's voices rose and fell in patterns that seemed both rhythmic and wrong. On the fifth day, Cora came instead. She descended the ladder slowly, her lantern trembling in her hand. She looked thinner, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. She untied one of his hands so he could drink, and when he took the cup, their fingers brushed. Her skin was cold. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered. She hesitated. "Because she says we must." Elias pressed on. "You don't believe her." Cora's gaze flickered upward, toward the ceiling. "Belief keeps her alive," she murmured. "Without it, she would fall apart. Without her, I am nothing." Then she set the cup down, retied the rope, and climbed away, leaving the lantern's dim light behind for a moment before closing the trapdoor. The small kindness broke something inside him. He began to watch for patterns in the sounds above, footsteps, doors, and the scrape of chairs. He marked them by counting under his breath. He learned their rhythm: morning, noon, dusk. He noticed that at certain hours, silence deepened, followed by the faint shuffle of many feet and the dull thud of chanting. The children, he thought. By the sixth day, hunger had conquered fear. He ate what they brought, hoping to regain strength. His thoughts sharpened with purpose. Escape. Each time Cora came, he tried to speak to her. Each time she ignored him, though her hands still trembled when she tied the knots. That evening he heard movement above, heavier than before. Alethea's voice rose in prayer, rhythmic and fervent. Another voice, several voices answered her in unison. He caught fragments again. The vessels return, the blood renews, the earth remembers. His skin crawled. Then came the unmistakable sound of a door opening, boots scraping, something dragged across the floor. For an hour, he heard nothing but chanting. When it stopped, the air changed. It smelled of smoke and iron. He realized, with slow horror, that whatever ritual had taken place above was meant for him. On the seventh day, the door opened once more. Both women descended this time. Cora held a lamp, her face pale. Alethea's eyes gleamed with something between ecstasy and exhaustion. She untied his ankles. "It is time," she said. Elias fought, but his strength was gone. Alethea's hands were surprisingly firm, her movements efficient. "Do not fear," she whispered. "Fear belongs to the dying world. You will be part of the new one." They lifted him halfway before a sound interrupted them, a crash from above. A child's cry. Alethea froze, then hissed an order at her sister. Cora looked torn between obedience and terror. For a moment, she did not move. Then, she turned toward Elias and pressed the lantern into his hands. "Run," she breathed. "Now." Alethea spun, shouting, but Elias swung the lantern. The flame burst, scattering oil. He shoved past them, his body propelled by desperation. Smoke filled the narrow pit, and as he climbed the ladder, he heard Alethea's scream, furious, not pained. He burst into the cabin, choking on soot and light. He did not see the children clearly, only flashes of pale limbs and eyes glinting in the half-dark. They moved like shadows, soundless but watchful. Elias stumbled through the doorway into the trees, the forest swallowing him whole. Behind him, the hollow exhaled a long, low sound, half-wind, half-human, as if it had been holding its breath too long. He ran until he could no longer hear it. Then he kept running anyway. Elias Munro did not remember how long he ran. Time had lost all structure inside the hollow, and outside it the forest felt no less hostile. The world narrowed to breath, blood, and the sting of branches tearing at his skin. He moved without direction, guided only by the thought that distance, any distance, was survival. Behind him, the air seemed to hum, a low vibration that might have been wind, or voices chasing him through the trees. He fell often, rose again, and kept moving until his body refused. When dawn came, he found himself collapsed beside a creek, face pressed into mud. His clothes were shredded, his hands raw from climbing through thorns. For a while he simply lay there, staring at the light filtering through leaves, unsure if he was alive or dreaming. He drank from the creek, gagging on the cold water, and crawled along its edge until he saw smoke in the distance. Not the thin, acrid thread of the hollow, but the sharp gray plume of a campfire. The men who found him were loggers, setting traps along the ridge. They took him first for a madman, filthy, half-dressed, muttering fragments of scripture and nonsense. When he tried to speak, his voice came out cracked, barely human. They carried him to their camp, wrapped him in a blanket, and sent a rider for the sheriff. Sheriff Amos Kettering arrived that evening, riding hard. He had been expecting bad news, though not like this. The loggers told him they'd found the man by the creek, half dead, and speaking of witches. Kettering knew better than to dismiss such words outright. He had seen too many small truths hide behind superstition. When he stepped into the tent where Elias lay, the air was heavy with the smell of blood and smoke. Elias was conscious but feverish, eyes wide and unfocused. His first words were a warning. "Don't go down there," he rasped. "It's not a place, it's a mouth." The sheriff knelt beside him and spoke softly. "You're safe now, Mr. Munro. Tell me what happened." It took hours for the story to come out, in pieces that Kettering pieced together like fragments of a shattered mirror. Elias told him about the cabin, the two women, Alethea and Cora Murnell, the food that made his body heavy, the cellar, the singing, the children. He described the spiral carvings, the prayers, the way Alethea spoke as if she were quoting a book no one else could read. He told him of his escape, of the fire, of running through the dark with voices following. Kettering listened without interruption. He did not write at first, he only watched. He had seen liars before, men who spoke too quickly, eyes darting away from memory. Elias spoke slowly, haltingly, as if every word cost him effort. His fear was not of discovery, but of being believed. When Elias finished, silence filled the tent. Outside, night insects hummed, steady and indifferent. The sheriff finally spoke. "You said there were children?" "Dozens," Elias whispered. Pale, quiet. "They watched me. They didn't speak." "Were they hurt?" Elias hesitated. "No. They were wrong. Not hurt. Not whole. Like they'd forgotten how to be people." Kettering wrote it down then. Each word. He had waited years for something more than rumor, and now it lay before him in the voice of a man who wanted nothing more than to forget. When he was done, he folded the paper carefully and slid it into his ledger. "You've done the right thing coming forward," he said. Elias shook his head weakly. "I didn't come. The hollow let me go." The sheriff stayed with him through the night. The fever broke near dawn, and Elias slept for the first time in days. When he woke, Kettering was still there, sitting by the lamp. The sheriff handed him a cup of water. "You can rest," he said, "but soon you'll need to show me the way." Elias's eyes widened. "You're going back?" "I am," Kettering replied. "And I'll bring men who can see the difference between fear and sin." Elias tried to protest, but his voice failed. He sank back into the blanket, exhausted. The sheriff rose, stepped outside, and looked toward the mountains. The first light of morning touched the ridges, painting them gold. But to Kettering, they looked like walls, ancient and watchful. He had spent his life chasing order through chaos, trying to bring law to a land that barely believed in it. Now he felt the weight of a truth older than law, older than faith itself. He knew the journey ahead would not be simple. If the hollow had taken root in the people's imagination, it was because something real had fed it, and he would find that something, even if it meant stepping into the silence that had claimed so many before him. 2 days later, after sending word to the county seat, he began selecting men for the task. Farmers, deputies, a few woodsmen he trusted with his life. 10 in total, each sworn to follow orders without question. He told them only what they needed to know, that they were investigating the disappearance of travelers, and that the land they entered would not welcome them. He left out the rest, the singing, the symbols, the children. Some truths, he thought, were better carried alone until proven real. Elias Monroe, still weak, agreed to guide them. His hands trembled when he signed the statement that authorized his testimony. Kettering placed the paper beside his revolver and said quietly, "Tomorrow we ride." That night, as he walked back through town, he passed the church. The bell hung silent. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark against the stars. He thought of the letter he had received months ago about a missing preacher, and of all the men whose names now filled his ledger. He whispered to himself, as if to justify what he already knew. The law must go where sin hides. But as he rode home, he couldn't shake Elias's last words from his mind. "The hollow let me go." It sounded less like mercy than a warning. In the early days of October, 1889, the Smokewater Mountains were beginning to change. The green of summer had faded into the bruised gold of autumn, and the air carried that sharp, metallic scent that came before frost. Sheriff Amos Kettering stood on the porch of the courthouse and watched the fog drift across the ridges like slow smoke. He had organized many search parties in his time, but none had felt like this one. This was not the hunt for a man, but for the boundary between sanity and belief. He had spent the week choosing his men. Some volunteered out of loyalty, others out of curiosity. He accepted only those who knew the mountains better than fear. Ben Trask, a hunter whose eyes could read tracks invisible to most. Nathan Cole, a deputy with a steady aim and a quiet mouth, and several farmers used to the patience of the land. Each man was told the same thing. They were investigating a string of disappearances, nothing more. He would not mention prophecy, nor witches, nor the strange faith that seemed to breathe through those woods. It was easier to lead them toward the truth than to warn them of it. They gathered supplies in silence: lanterns, ropes, shovels, rifles polished more out of habit than expectation. Kettering forbade liquor. "We go sober and straight," he said, "because whatever waits for us in that hollow will not need courage we borrow from a bottle." Most nodded. A few laughed nervously. The sheriff let them. Men laughed when their fear was too heavy to carry in silence. Elias Monroe joined them on the second morning. He looked older than when Kettering had first found him, his face hollowed by exhaustion. His hair had grown uneven, his clothes hung loose, and his hands never quite stopped trembling. He carried no weapon, only a notebook and the compass the sheriff had returned to him. The men watched him quietly, none daring to ask what he had seen. They had heard enough from whispers around town, that he'd crawled out of a pit full of bones, that he'd spoken with women who prayed to the dirt. Elias corrected no one. He simply said, "I can take you there, but you must not linger." The sheriff studied him. "We'll stay as long as it takes," he said. Elias's reply was almost a whisper. "That's what they said to me." The morning they left, the sky was low and colorless. They rode in a column along the river trail, hooves splashing through cold water. No one spoke much. The mountains loomed ahead, vast and unmoved. The sheriff rode at the front beside Elias, who pointed out landmarks with slow precision. A split cedar, a bend in the creek, a ridge shaped like a sleeping dog. He seemed to navigate by instinct rather than memory. "The hollow doesn't stay still," he said once. "It listens. It shifts." The men behind exchanged uneasy glances. By noon, they reached the last inhabited farmstead before the wilderness. The farmer, an old man named Dillard, came out to meet them. When Kettering explained where they were headed, Dillard's face drained of color. "You'll find nothing but God's absence down there," he said. "And that's worse than finding the devil." He refused to sell them fresh horses, muttering that beasts with sense didn't go that way. The sheriff thanked him and moved on. The climb grew steeper. Trails disappeared beneath carpets of leaves. The air cooled until each breath came out white. Now and then, they saw signs of old life: collapsed fences, the ruins of a cabin overtaken by vines, but never a sound of birds or game. Ben Trask muttered. "Even the squirrels moved out." The sheriff said nothing. He felt the silence pressing closer, as if the mountains themselves were listening. They camped that night beside a dry creek bed. The men built a small fire, its light barely pushing back the dark. Over supper, the talk turned restless. One asked how long they'd be gone. Another joked about ghosts. Elias sat apart, staring into the flames. When Kettering joined him, he said quietly, "It's worse at night. They come to the edge of the trees and watch. You won't hear them, but you'll feel it like the air is thinking about you." The sheriff regarded him. "And if they come?" "Don't speak first," Elias said. "Words are invitations there." Kettering nodded, unsure if he believed him, but grateful for the warning. That night, he couldn't sleep. The woods seemed to breathe around the camp, each gust of wind like an exhale through unseen lungs. Once, he thought he saw movement beyond the firelight, a flicker, too smooth for an animal. He reached for his revolver, then stopped. The sound faded, or perhaps it had never been there. At dawn, they broke camp and continued upward. The trail narrowed, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses single file. The fog grew thicker, curling between the trunks like smoke rising from unseen fires. Elias walked ahead, his steps sure despite his trembling. "It's close," he said. "You'll smell it before you see it." He was right. Before long, the air changed heavier, laced with the faint scent of burnt wood and something else, faintly sweet, faintly rotten. The forest had no birdsong now, no rustle of life. Even the sound of their boots seemed swallowed. The sheriff felt the men behind him growing tense, breaths shallow, eyes scanning the shadows. At a narrow bend in the path, Elias stopped. He pointed to a dead oak at the edge of a ravine. Its trunk was carved with the spiral pattern the sheriff remembered from his earlier visit, 7 lines crossing at the center. The bark around it was blackened, as though scorched. "This is the gate," Elias said. "Once we pass that mark, we're inside. Nothing beyond here belongs to us." Kettering stared at the symbol, tracing it with his gloved hand. It was cut deep, precise, not the work of madness but of ritual. He turned to his men. "No one fires unless I give the word. We go in calm, and we come out with proof. That's the only way this ends right." The men nodded, though their faces were pale. Elias said nothing more. He stepped forward, into the mist. One by one, the others followed, the sheriff last. The fog thickened until the world became a single color, the sound of their boots muffled like footsteps in a dream, and somewhere ahead, faint and steady, came the smell of smoke, the same bitter scent that had haunted the sheriff since the first time he heard the name Crowder's Hollow. He tightened his grip on the reins and whispered to himself, "We're here now." And from the silence, something seemed to whisper back. The path into Crowder's Hollow narrowed until the men were forced to walk single file. Fog licked at their boots, curling upward in long white ribbons that never quite broke apart. The trees grew taller here, old beyond reckoning, their trunks gnarled like twisted ropes. No wind stirred their branches. Even the horses snorted uneasily, ears flicking back at sounds the men could not hear. It was a silence deeper than stillness, as if the mountain itself had drawn breath and refused to exhale. Elias led the way, one hand brushing the air in front of him, as if feeling for something unseen. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though the ground might shift beneath him. "It changes here," he murmured. "The hollow isn't just a place, it's the breath between one heartbeat and the next." None of the men replied. Words felt heavy, wrong. They passed the first sign within an hour. A line of wooden stakes stood half-buried along the path, their tops wrapped in rags gone gray with age. Some bore carvings, circles, crosses, spirals, but all were marked with soot. The smell of smoke was stronger now, not clean wood smoke, but something fouler, tinged with rot. Ben Trask muttered a prayer under his breath. Nathan Cole kicked one of the stakes and instantly regretted it. The wood cracked open, revealing what looked like bone splinters inside. Kettering held up his hand. "No one touches anything from here on." His voice came out rougher than intended, but it steadied the men. They moved slower after that, rifles slung but ready. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The ground grew soft, spongy beneath their boots, and the trees seemed to lean inward, their trunks bending toward the path like listeners. Every few yards, they found traces of life, a broken pot, a strip of cloth, the half-buried skeleton of a mule. Elias recognized none of it. "It wasn't like this when I came," he said quietly. The trees were thicker, The air, warmer. It feels hollowed out now. At a bend in the trail, they found what had once been a fence-rotted posts, half swallowed by vines. Beyond it lay a narrow clearing, choked with weeds. The fog pooled there like water, dense enough to hide the ground. In its center stood a structure barely standing, a shack of logs and stones, its roof sagging under moss. A sign carved into one of the beams caught the sheriff's eye. It was a spiral again, but this one different 7 lines converging, yet at the center, the carving broke open like an eye. Kettering motioned for silence. He could feel the men's nerves fraying, their patience stretched thin by the unending quiet. Somewhere ahead, a crow gave a single cry, sharp, abrupt, and then fell silent. Elias turned slowly, his face drained of color. "It's close," he said. They moved past the ruined shack. Beyond it, the ground dipped steeply downward into the basin proper. The fog thickened into a wall. The sheriff dismounted and tied his horse to a branch. The others followed suit. From this point, they would walk. The horses refused to move further anyway, hooves planted, eyes rolling white. Elias crouched and ran his hand along the soil. It came away black, damp, and streaked with something dark that was not mud. "Char," he said, "but not from fire." He wiped his hand on his sleeve, then straightened, pointing ahead. Through the fog, faint shapes began to emerge, outlines of dwellings, crude and low to the ground, like nests built by hands that had forgotten the art of building. The sheriff's heart thudded. He gestured for the men to spread out, keeping sight of one another. They moved slowly, boots sinking into the soft earth. The smell was stronger now, thick and sour. Smoke, sweat, decay, and something metallic underneath it all. A smell that spoke of too many bodies and too little air. The first lean-to appeared beside a fallen tree, covered with scraps of cloth and bark. Inside lay a heap of rags that at first looked like debris. Then it moved. A small figure, thin, pale, eyes wide and lightless, stared out at them before vanishing into the fog. Ben Trask swore. "Child," he hissed. "There's children here." Elias's voice was almost a whisper. "Not children. Not the way you think." They saw more of them after that, small shapes darting between trees, glimpsed only for moments. None made a sound. Their movements were too quick, too synchronized, as if guided by a single thought. Kettering kept his voice low. "Hold steady. No weapons unless I say." A shape loomed ahead through the fog the cabin. It stood crooked at the heart of the clearing, roof patched with hides, smoke curling through a hole near the peak. The ground around it was scattered with smaller huts, lean-tos, and pits covered with woven mats. The spiral symbol was carved into nearly every surface, blackened by soot, drawn even on stones. The sheriff felt his pulse slow to match the stillness around him. "That's it," he said softly. "The Murnell place." Elias stopped short. "It wasn't this quiet before," he said. "They knew I was coming that day. They were waiting outside." "Maybe they still are," Kettering murmured. As if in answer, a door creaked open. 2 figures stepped into view. Alethea and Cora Murnell stood side by side at the threshold, still and unflinching. Their dresses were clean but old, colors long faded to gray. Alethea's hair was braided tightly down her back, streaked with silver. Cora's hung loose around her face. Neither showed surprise nor fear, only a steady, calm acknowledgement, as though this meeting had been promised long ago. Alethea spoke first, her voice even and low. "You've come to see what the Lord preserved." Kettering stepped forward. "We've come to ask about the men who disappeared." "There were no disappearances," she said. "Only the returning of what was taken. The Hollow gives and takes, as it must." The sheriff's hand rested near his revolver, though he did not draw it. "You're under suspicion for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. We can do this the easy way." Alethea's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. "There is no easy way, not for those who trespass on covenant soil." Before the sheriff could answer, the fog around them seemed to stir. One by one the small shapes appeared again, children, dozens of them, stepping out from between the huts. They formed a loose circle around the cabin, their pale faces expressionless, their eyes reflecting what little light the fog allowed. Not a sound came from them. Elias backed away slowly. "Sheriff," he whispered, "don't move fast. They'll follow her lead." Kettering stood rooted, torn between duty and dread. He could feel the weight of the men's fear pressing against his back. Alethea raised one hand, palm outward. "Do not fear them," she said. "They are the beginning." For a moment no one breathed. Then Cora spoke for the first time, her voice soft and cracking. "Sister, please." Alethea turned to her, eyes sharp as flint. "Hush! The reckoning's come." The sheriff saw the tremor in Cora's hands, the flicker of doubt. He took a slow step forward. "We're not here to harm anyone," he said quietly. "Let the children step back." Alethea lowered her hand. The children did not move. They stood still as stones, their silence louder than screams. The fog pressed closer, curling around the cabin like breath drawn in for a final word. The clearing seemed to hold its breath. The mist drifted in slow currents around them, soft as smoke, but thick enough to blur the edges of the world. For a moment, no one moved. Sheriff Kettering stood at the front of his line, one hand near his revolver, the other raised slightly in an appeal for calm. The children ringed the space between the trees and the cabin, still and voiceless, their faces pale beneath streaks of soot. Alethea Murnell broke the silence. "You've come far to see the beginning of things," she said. Her tone was not defiant but solemn, almost priestly. "The Hollow has waited for you, Sheriff. It remembers those who doubt." Kettering answered in a measured voice. "I don't doubt, ma'am. I deal in proof. And proof says there are men gone missing up here. You'll tell me where they are." Alethea's lips curved slightly, a look of faint pity crossing her face. "Gone?" she repeated. "Nothing is gone that fulfills its purpose. The world beyond these mountains will rot itself to bone, and from that rot a new blood must rise. That is the law of creation." She gestured toward the children. "Do they not look alive to you? They are the fruit of covenant." The sheriff felt his throat tighten. He had seen madness before, the wild rant of drunks and zealots, but never with this calm conviction. "And their fathers?" he asked quietly. "They were vessels," she said. "The seed returns to soil." At that, one of the deputies, young nervous, made a small sound of disgust. The children turned toward him in perfect unison. Their movements were eerie, more instinct than reaction. Not one spoke, yet the air seemed to thicken with the weight of their stare. The deputy took an involuntary step back. "Jesus," he muttered. Alethea's gaze snapped to him. "Do not take his name here," she warned. "The lord of this place does not share his throne with yours." "Enough," Kettering said firmly. "You'll stand down now. My men will secure the area." Alethea's eyes glittered. "You think this is your ground to secure?" she said. "You walk on sacred earth. Every root here hears what you say." The sheriff nodded once to Ben Trask. "Move slow," he whispered. "No sudden pulls. Check the huts." The men spread out, careful, rifles lowered. The children did not move, but their eyes followed every motion. The fog made distances uncertain. Shadows seemed to fold and stretch between the trees. As Kettering approached the cabin, he noticed the carvings more clearly. Spirals etched not just into wood, but into stone, into the very soil, as though the ground itself had been branded. He stopped at the threshold. "Alethea Murnell," he said, "I'm placing you under arrest for kidnapping and unlawful confinement. You'll come with us peacefully, or I'll have no choice but to take you by force." Alethea did not step back. "You cannot arrest what has already been judged," she said. "Your laws end where faith begins." Cora stood beside her, trembling. Her lips moved as if to speak, but no words came. Kettering saw something flicker in her eyes, a faint, desperate plea. "Ma'am," he said softly, addressing her, "you can end this. No one else needs to die." At that, Alethea turned sharply toward her sister. "Do not listen," she hissed. "He's of the world we left behind. He speaks with the serpent's tongue." Cora's hands lifted slightly, palms open, shaking. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse. "Sister, please. They don't understand. Let them go." Alethea's expression hardened. "The covenant is not for breaking." Something in the air shifted, then a tremor that passed through the children like wind through grass. Their formation wavered, then tightened again. One of the men, frightened, raised his rifle. Kettering shouted, "Hold fire!" But the damage was done. The tension had become a living thing. Alethea raised both arms, her voice rising into a chant. The words were foreign, half scripture, half sound. The children answered in whispers, dozens of voices weaving into one low hum. It vibrated in the men's bones. Elias Monroe stumbled backward, hands over his ears. "That's it," he gasped. "That's what I heard before when they prayed." Kettering forced himself forward. "Enough!" he bellowed. "This ends now." Alethea stopped mid-word. The humming ceased instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Slowly, she lowered her arms and smiled a weary, terrible smile. "So be it," she said. "The new world waits in the ashes of the old." She turned to her sister. "Cora!" Cora's eyes were wide, tearful. "No," she whispered. "Cora," Alethea repeated, her tone suddenly soft, almost maternal. "Remember what Father taught us. Obedience is salvation." Cora's knees weakened. She looked from her sister to the sheriff, to the ring of silent children. Her mouth opened, closed again, and then, in a voice barely audible, she said, "Forgive me." The sheriff moved first, stepping forward to seize Alethea's arm. She did not resist. Her eyes met his, calm and unblinking. "Do you believe now?" she asked. "I believe you're coming with me," Kettering said. At that signal, the deputies advanced. The circle of children parted slightly, allowing them through. It was almost as if some unspoken command held them at bay. Cora stood frozen, watching as her sister was bound. Alethea offered no struggle, no word of protest. Only when Kettering turned to lead her out did she speak again, voice low but clear. "The Hollow keeps its promises, Sheriff. It always does." They led her toward the edge of the clearing. Behind them, Cora fell to her knees. The children slowly retreated into the mist, dissolving one by one, until the fog swallowed their shapes entirely. The forest was utterly still again. When they reached the ridge, the sheriff glanced back. The cabin loomed faintly through the haze, its roof sagging, its door open. Cora remained kneeling in the dirt, head bowed, alone. The air smelled of smoke and damp wood, but the fire had gone out. Kettering did not know then whether he had witnessed surrender or prophecy. All he knew was that the mountain had given them what it chose to give, and nothing more. After the arrest, Sheriff Amos Kettering ordered his men to remain steady. The fog had begun to thin, but only slightly. The light that filtered through it was pale and untrustworthy. Alethea Murnell stood bound at the wrists, her head lifted, her expression unbroken. She looked less like a prisoner than a prophet who had finally been granted an audience. Cora remained on her knees near the doorway, silent, her fingers twisting in the hem of her skirt. The sheriff turned to his deputies. "Search everything," he said. "Every hut, every pit, every inch of that cabin." His tone left no room for hesitation. "We need proof, something the law can hold." The men spread out. Each step they took seemed to echo too loudly in the quiet. The children had vanished completely. Not a single footprint marked their departure. The air smelled of earth and smoke, overripe with the scent of decay. Nathan Cole approached the first lean-to and lifted its flap. Inside lay nothing but a few bones, animal perhaps, though the shape of them was wrong. He swallowed hard and moved to the next. Ben Trask found a pit lined with woven mats. When he lifted one, a swarm of beetles scattered. Beneath it was a bed of straw blackened by fire. "Sheriff," he called. "You'll want to see this." Kettering approached. He knelt, touched the scorched straw, and caught the faint odor of oil. "Burned recently," he murmured. "They tried to hide something." Alethea, still standing in the doorway, spoke calmly. "Nothing hides in the Hollow. Everything returns." Kettering ignored her. "Keep looking," he ordered. Inside the cabin, the air was close and stifling. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, releasing a sickly sweet smell that clung to the lungs. The walls were covered with symbols, spirals, crosses, words half in English, half in something older. On a shelf lay jars of herbs and bone dust, and beside them, a wooden box carved with the same spiral mark. The sheriff opened it. Inside were personal effects: a pocket watch, a bent pair of spectacles, a torn scrap of cloth embroidered with initials S, D, B. He froze. It matched the missing preacher's belongings from years earlier. "Dear God," he whispered. Elias Monroe, standing nearby, leaned closer. His face had gone pale. "That's what I saw," he said. "The box, the things. They keep them like relics." On the far side of the room, one of the deputies knelt beside the trapdoor in the floor. Its edges were black with soot, and a crude iron hook served as a latch. "Sheriff," the man said, "there's something under here." Kettering nodded. "Open it carefully." They pried it loose. A breath of cold, wet air rose from below, carrying the smell of rot and damp clay. The deputy held a lantern over the opening. The light reached only a few feet down, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Elias took an involuntary step back. "That's it," he said hoarsely. "That's where they kept me." Kettering's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he said. "Cole, Trask, come with me." He took the lantern and descended first, the iron rungs slick beneath his boots. The air thickened as he went down, heavy with the scent of mildew and something older, sour and metallic. When his feet touched the packed earth floor, he lifted the lantern. The beam revealed a small chamber, no more than 10 feet across. The walls were reinforced with rough planks, the ceiling low enough to brush his hat. Chains hung from one post. In one corner lay a pile of rags, damp and darkened with stains, and in another, a shallow pit, half filled with water and bones, some animal, some not. Nathan Cole cursed softly. Ben Trask crossed himself. Kettering crouched beside the pit, studying it without touching. The bones were mixed haphazardly. Deer, rabbit, human. A child's shoe lay among them. "We'll take what we can for evidence," he said. His voice was steady, but inside, something in him was shaking. As he turned, his light caught a shape on the far wall, a board nailed horizontally, covered in parchment pages sewn together with twine. The writing was faded but legible, a sprawling script that mixed scripture with something else. Across the top, in large, uneven letters, it read, "The Testament of Ezra." Kettering lifted the lantern closer. The first line read, "In the cleansing of the old world, the pure blood shall renew the mountain, and through the mothers shall the seed of deliverance come." Beneath it, countless verses, prayers, commandments, genealogies, all repeating the same obsession: purity, birth, renewal, and fire. He exhaled slowly. "Ezra Murnell," he murmured. "Their father's gospel." "Sheriff," Ben Trask said quietly, "what kind of people write their own Bible?" "The kind who forget the real one," Kettering replied. They carried the pages up carefully, along with the box of trinkets. When they emerged into the dim daylight, the men waiting outside fell silent. Alethea watched them, expression unchanged. "You've found what you wanted," she said. "Does it comfort you?" Kettering stepped forward. "It condemns you," he said. "You and everyone who helped you." "Condemnation is the world's word," she said calmly. "We were chosen long before your courts were born." Cora rose slowly from her knees. "Sister," she said, voice trembling, "please stop." But Alethea did not stop. "You'll bury us," she said to the sheriff, "and in time, you'll dig us up again. The hollow does not die. It waits. It remembers." Elias turned away, unable to meet her gaze. The sheriff gave the order to bind both women and begin the return journey. The men worked quickly, gathering their evidence, covering the pit, dousing the fires. By the time they left the clearing, the fog had begun to lift. Sunlight pierced through in thin, reluctant beams, revealing the forest in stark color. Kettering paused at the ridge and looked back one final time. The clearing lay still, stripped bare. The cabin seemed smaller now, its doorway gaping like a wound. He could almost believe the silence was relief, but then, from somewhere deep within the trees, he thought he heard faint voices, high, distant, almost musical. Children, singing without words. He turned away and kept walking. The trial of Alethea and Cora Murnell began in January of 1891 in the courthouse at Prestonburg, a gray stone building whose walls still bore the marks of cannon fire from the war decades before. Outside, snow fell in soft sheets, muting the noise of the crowd that had gathered from miles around. Inside, the courtroom was packed to its rafters, miners, preachers, wives clutching their children, and journalists from as far away as Louisville and Cincinnati. They had come to witness what the newspapers had already called the witches of Smokewater. Sheriff Amos Kettering sat near the front, his hat in his lap, his expression unreadable. He had testified twice before the trial officially opened, presenting the relics, the bones, the written pages of the Testament of Ezra. Yet even now, as he looked toward the two women seated at the defense table, he felt no satisfaction. Alethea Murnell sat straight-backed, hands folded neatly, eyes forward. She wore a plain gray dress and a shawl draped around her shoulders. Cora, beside her, looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a heavy coat, her hair covering half her face. She had not spoken since the day of their arrest. The prosecutor, William Densmore, was a man of sharp features and righteous voice. He stood before the jury and began, "Gentlemen, you will hear a tale that defies reason, yet it is reason itself we must preserve. These women sisters lured men to their dwelling under false pretenses, imprisoned them, and raised children in a state of unspeakable neglect and blasphemy. We have evidence of human remains found beneath their floor, writings that mock both scripture and decency, and witness testimony from the one man who escaped their grasp. The Commonwealth demands justice not only for the dead but for the living who must walk these mountains in fear." All eyes turned to the defense table. Alethea remained still, her face illuminated by a thin beam of winter light. When asked if she had counsel, she spoke clearly. "I will speak for myself." Her voice carried effortlessly across the room, measured and steady. "No man can speak the truth I was given." The judge, a weary man named Corbin Luttrell, frowned but allowed it. "You will have your chance, Mrs. Murnell. For now, the Commonwealth will proceed." Elias Monroe was the first witness. He took the stand with visible reluctance, hat twisting in his hands. The courtroom held its breath as he recounted his story: the stew, the cellar, the singing, the escape. His words were plain, clinical almost, but there were moments when his voice broke, and his eyes lost focus, as if reliving the nightmare. "They said I was chosen," he murmured. "Chosen to seed a new world. I thought it was madness. Then I saw the children." The prosecutor asked gently, "How many, Mr. Monroe?" "More than 20, Elias said, all with the same pale eyes." A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge rapped his gavel for silence. The prosecution then called Sheriff Kettering. He described the investigation, the evidence, the discovery of the Testament of Ezra. He did not embellish, did not raise his voice. When shown the box of relics, the pocket watch, the Bible, the spectacles, he confirmed each item matched a man long reported missing. "The proof speaks for itself," he concluded. "They believed they were doing holy work, but what they did was murder dressed in prayer." When it came time for the defense, Alethea rose slowly. She thanked the judge with a nod and turned toward the jury. "You speak of murder," she said. "I speak of birth. My father, Ezra Murnell, received the word of God not from pulpits or men but from the mountain itself. He was told the world would drown again, not in water, but in sin, and only those of pure blood, those who kept apart, would rise anew. We obeyed, we kept the faith, we took what the Lord sent us, and we gave back life. You call it blasphemy, because you cannot see past your own corruption." Densmore objected, but the judge let her continue, perhaps curious, perhaps horrified. Alethea began to recite from memory passages of her father's testament. "The womb of the chosen shall cleanse the land. The seed of the wanderer shall mix with the pure, that the line may be restored." Her eyes gleamed as she spoke, not with madness but with certainty. "Each man who came to us was led by providence. We did not steal them, they were offered. The earth claimed them afterward, as was written. The children they gave were sanctified by solitude. You cannot call wicked what was ordained before your nation drew its first breath." The courtroom shifted restlessly. Someone in the crowd shouted, "You're a devil!" Another woman began to cry. The judge pounded his gavel again. "Order! There will be order in this room." Alethea's expression did not change. "The Lord's order is already here," she said softly. "It began long before you sat in judgment." Then she looked toward her sister. "Cora, tell them." All eyes turned. Cora stared down at her hands. Her lips moved, but no sound came. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. The judge sighed. "Does the younger sister wish to testify?" Cora shook her head once, tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. "She speaks for me," she whispered. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Indeed she does, and what she says condemns you both." But Alethea smiled faintly. "Condemnation is the world's word," she repeated. "We do not belong to your world." The trial dragged on for days. Expert witnesses testified about the bones, the herbs, the strange dialects in the Testament. Reporters filled pages with words like cult, heathen, bloodright. Yet, through it all, Alethea remained composed. She listened to every accusation as though hearing prophecy fulfilled. When the time came for closing arguments, Densmore stood before the jury and spoke with weary gravity. "Gentlemen, I have seen many sins in my time, but none wrapped so tightly in the garments of virtue. This woman believes she served God by killing his creations. If such faith is allowed to stand, then law means nothing, and we are left to the mercy of those who mistake madness for revelation." When the judge finally called for a verdict, The deliberation lasted less than 3 hours. The sisters were found guilty of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and the abuse of minors. The charge of murder could not be proven without bodies. The judge's voice trembled as he delivered the sentence. You are both to be confined indefinitely to the Ashfield Asylum for the criminally insane, where you will remain under the care of the Commonwealth for the rest of your natural lives. Alethea inclined her head as though accepting a sacrament. The world burns, she said quietly. We will outlast its ashes. Cora wept openly for the first time. As the guards led them away, the crowd erupted, some in anger, others in relief. A woman near the door crossed herself and whispered, God have mercy on those mountains. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. Sheriff Kettering watched as the carriage doors closed, the chains rattling faintly. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. Yet beneath it was no peace, only the uneasy sense that the Hollow had not finished speaking. The children were taken from Crowder's Hollow 3 days after the arrest. There were 23 of them in all, though no one could say for certain if that was the full number. They emerged from the mist like ghosts, thin, barefoot, eyes wide and glassy. Some were too young to walk without help. Others, though older, moved in silence, their bodies stiff and cautious, as if learning the act of motion itself. They did not speak. When questioned, they stared at their captors with an unsettling calm, as if words had no place in the world they had been given. The county had no facilities for them, no orphanage prepared for such strangeness. For a time, they were housed in the church basement under the care of local women and a pair of ministers from neighboring towns. Blankets were laid across the floor, food brought from nearby farms. The older children ate sparingly, the younger ones hardly at all. When night came, they refused to sleep until the lamps were extinguished. Then, in the dark, they would hum low, rhythmic sounds that made the caretaker's skin crawl. Doctors were brought in from Knoxville to examine them. Their findings filled the newspapers for weeks. The children's teeth were sound, but their growth stunted, their eyes unusually light, their skin pale to translucence. Their dialect, when it appeared, was fragmented English, tangled with archaic words, phrases no one recognized. The doctors called it a case of severe social and linguistic isolation. The locals called it a curse. By spring, several of the youngest were dead. The official cause was pneumonia, but the nurses whispered that the children simply stopped breathing, as if refusing life outside the Hollow. Those who survived were dispersed to various institutions and foster homes across the state. Reports followed them for years. Nightmares, seizures, violent fits of silence. Some disappeared again, slipping away into woods and fields, never to return. Within a decade, not one remained in public record. As for Alethea and Cora Murnell, they were transported to Ashfield Asylum under heavy guard. The newspapers printed their departure in cold detail. 2 female inmates received aged 63 and 56 respectively, diagnosed with shared religious mania. Alethea was placed in solitary confinement after she began preaching to the other patients through the heating vents. She ate little, slept rarely, and spent her days writing on the walls with charcoal, filling them with spirals and scripture until the attendants scrubbed them away. Cora was kept in the infirmary after several breakdowns. She seldom spoke, but sometimes sang tuneless, wordless melodies that the nurses could not bear to hear. Alethea died first, in the winter of 1895. The official report listed heart failure, though the attending physician noted that her expression was one of contentment, as if she had awaited this moment. Cora survived her by 6 years. Her final words, recorded by a nurse who did not understand them, were, "The children are waiting." She was buried beside her sister in the asylum's unmarked field. Sheriff Amos Kettering retired the following year. He was offered a citation for his service but declined it. He moved to a small house near the river and seldom spoke of the case again. Those who visited him in his final years described a man haunted not by guilt, but by wonder, someone who had seen something that could not be named. Sometimes, on cold evenings, he would walk to the edge of the forest and stand for hours, staring toward the ridges where the Hollow once lay hidden. When asked what he was looking for, he answered only, "To see if it's breathing again." He died in 1902, found in his chair by the window, his notebook open beside him. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. "The land is quiet now, but the quiet feels like watching." By the turn of the century, Crowder's Hollow had vanished from official maps. The railroad survey erased it entirely, marking the area as impassable terrain. Trees reclaimed the cabins. Floods reshaped the creek. Travelers passing through sometimes reported strange sights, lights flickering in the mist, or children's laughter carried on the wind. But such claims were easy to dismiss. The hollow, it seemed, had gone back to sleep. Still, in Whitlow County, people avoided the ridge. Hunters told of finding the spiral symbol carved freshly into trees after storms. A preacher's son swore that one night he saw two women walking along the creek in the moonlight, their hands clasped as they disappeared into the fog. He tried to follow, but when he reached the clearing, there was nothing but the smell of smoke and wet earth. The legend of the Murnell sisters faded slowly, the way all stories do when no one is left to defend them. Yet it lingered, half buried, like roots beneath the soil. Parents still warned their children not to stray too far into the mountains. And sometimes, when fog rolled down from the ridges and the forest grew unnaturally still, old-timers would murmur the same words. The hollow remembers. The last to speak of it was Reverend Samuel Hodge, who had come to Whitlow in 1910 to rebuild the church that once housed the children. In his diary, discovered after his death, he wrote of waking one night to the sound of humming outside his window. "I thought it was the river," he wrote, "until I heard the harmony, soft, sweet, not of this world. When I looked out, the mist was thick, and I saw small figures moving through it, hand in hand." He never wrote of it again. Years passed, and the Smokewater Mountains changed as all things do. The forests grew thicker, swallowing what remained of the old trails. The rivers shifted course, erasing the paths men had once carved. By the time the century turned, the people of Whitlow County no longer spoke of Crowder's Hollow, except as a rumor older than memory. Its name disappeared from maps, from deeds, from the mouths of surveyors who found nothing but wilderness where it once had been. But silence, in those mountains, is never truly empty. It holds its own kind of remembrance. The hollow returned to the earth, but its story did not. Travelers passing along the new rail line sometimes told of lights seen moving far above the tree line, small, flickering orbs that vanished when approached. Hunters spoke of hearing children's laughter at dusk, soft and distant, though no footprints ever marked the snow. A miner once claimed that deep within a newly opened shaft, he found the spiral symbol carved into the stone, fresh and sharp, as if it had been made the night before. No one believed him, but when the mine flooded months later, drowning 6 men, the older folks said the mountain had taken back what was owed. In the spring of 1923, a flood swept through the valley and uncovered what looked like the remains of a foundation near the ridge. The workers clearing debris reported finding fragments of burned wood and a piece of iron carved with words barely legible. The hollow keeps its promises. The artifact was sent to a museum in Nashville, where it was catalogued and forgotten in a basement drawer. Those who still remembered Sheriff Kettering said that he had foreseen it. He used to say the hollow was patient, one man recalled, that it waited until folks stopped fearing it. That's when it would start breathing again. Generations came and went. Farms gave way to timber companies, then to empty land again. The old courthouse where the trial had been held was torn down in the 1952, its stone reused for a post office. The asylum at Ashfield burned in 1964 lightning strike, they said. Every inmate's record lost in the fire. Some swore it was coincidence. Others whispered that fire was the hollow's true inheritance, the final cleansing that Ezra Murnell had promised so long ago. By the 1972, only one person remained who could trace the tale to its beginning. Her name was Lydia Hart, a nurse who had once worked at Ashfield before the fire. In her 80s, she told a young journalist that 2 women there had frightened even the doctors, one who preached in her sleep, the other who sang lullabies to the walls. They said the older one died smiling, Lydia remembered, like she'd seen someone waiting for her. When asked what she thought of their story, she shook her head. "Some people build their own heavens," she said softly. "They just forget how to leave them." Crowder's Hollow never appeared again on any chart, but the land still bears its shape. If you climb the Smokewater Ridge at dusk and look north, you can see the basin, a gentle dip filled with fog, even on the hottest day. No birds fly over it. Locals avoid it without quite knowing why. They say the air there feels too still, too listening. A traveler once described hearing faint music there, like someone humming a hymn through the ground. In Whitlow, where stories die slow deaths, Old men still tell the tale to their grandchildren on stormy nights. They speak of a sheriff who chased faith into the wilderness, of sisters who mistook their father's voice for God's, of children born without words who taught the mountain how to remember. The young ones listen, half in fear, half in disbelief, until the fire burns low, and then, when the wind rattles the shutters, they glance toward the hills and wonder if the mountain is still awake. Because sometimes, just before dawn, a gray smoke rises briefly above the ridge, thin, trembling, almost invisible. It vanishes before the sun touches it, leaving behind only the faint smell of cedar and ash. Some say it's the breath of the hollow, stirring in its sleep. Others say it's nothing but mist and memory. But those who know the mountains best never try to name it. They only bow their heads and walk a little faster down the trail, whispering a prayer not taught in any church. The hollow remembers, the hollow forgives, the hollow waits, and in that endless waiting, the mountains keep their silence patient, ancient, and alive.